Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place where we can have some fun, meet some great people, and maybe learn some things along the way. I'm really excited for my guest today. My guest today is Kelsey Hightower. Kelsey, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself?
Yo, I'm Kelsey Hightower. A lot of y'all know me from the open source space, probably Kubernetes most recently, and then various communities before that. So happy to be here.
Yeah, well, I think, one of the things I love to chat about with folks is kind of their origin story and how they got started in tech. I mean, I know a little bit about your story and you can kind of drill into a little bit, but do you remember like that point in time where you came across technology, came across, you know, open source or some of the things that you're currently working on today or some things that you worked on, like, hey, this is what I want to do. This is my thing. No matter what I've been doing before that, I want to do this for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was introduced to technology in high school. There's a program called like the Technology Student Association (TSA), and that was a good introduction to like this is a thing and the various aspects of technology. But when I really realized that this is what I wanted my career to be is when I decided to drop out of college, like first semester in, and like got A plus certified, Network plus certified, Linux plus certified. So those old school tech IT certifications. And I was like, wow, I could actually make a job out of this. The material's pretty accessible. I like the ideas of problem solving. I like the idea of like just the way computers were going. So around 1999, I was like all in, like this is it. And that was my starting path.
That's great. I mean, so I think one of the things that I love following about you is that you're very open about all sorts of technology, whether they're, things that are new, things that are existing, things that are kind of, I guess you could call a little bit legacy or more known in the market. Like, what are some of the things that excite you when you talk about technology with folks out in the community?
I mean, the thing that excites me the most is whenever kind of these patterns that are seem very complex or only a few people know how to deal with them, we make them mainstream. Like when Kubernetes made distributed systems mainstream, when Docker made reproducible builds and isolation mainstream. And you
Yeah.
see this with programming languages too, right? Whenever, like when Apple came out with the SDK for the iPhone so you can build native apps, they took something that they can only do and then gave you this toolkit so you can build the same things. That's the thing that gets me the most excited. So it doesn't really matter the space, the vertical, the technology, but whenever as an industry we figure out something that was a niche and then let you be able to do it too, man, I'm all in for that.
Yeah, I think there's something really interesting to say about like figuring out different ways to solve problems, right? Like I think a lot of folks will probably agree like there's not a lot of like really sophisticated problems in tech, right? I think there's a lot of problems out there, but for predominantly most developers don't work on those problems, right? They're working on some data source, they're trying to build some app on top of that data source. So it's about what sort of tools that we can use to be successful, right? Trying to do our job that probably a million other developers out there are doing, right? And you mentioned a couple of things that are really pertinent to me. Like, so when you're well known in the, I guess, the microservices containerization space, right? So what really interested you about that sort of stuff when it came out initially?
It's just where I was on my journey. When I started in this space, I was a small business owner with a small computer repair shop. So I was always interested in like, are there going to be better 56K modems that are not Winsoft based that can survive
Sure.
a lightning strike, right? So it's just where I was in my career at the time. But I came from a world where I was contributing to Python. I was
Hmm.
contributing to PyPy and some of the tools, disutils back then. After learning Python, I was in the configuration management space. But one thing that I seen, whether working as a job at ops or in development, it was always too hard to build reliable infrastructure. So
Yeah.
if you have an app that's ready to go, you have to like spend so much time just getting the servers to play nice
Yeah.
with everything else. So when I saw Docker and then Kubernetes, I was like, finally, 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 we can get out of this per language deployment scripts and build things. We can now get to some higher level concepts. And it felt like probably when the world went from assembly code to higher level programming
Sure.
languages, that now we can do things in a more repeatable fashion and then use the same vocabulary to describe what needs to be done and then go do it.
Yeah, I think that's really spot on. It's about ease of use, right? Like I think I'm not a very old developer, but I remember like having to remote into VMs and doing all these sort of things and jumping through all these hoops and making sure firewalls are set up correctly. And it's like, why? Like, why do I need to do all this stuff? And it seems to me, you know, the pendulum is always shifting from like easy to more configurable, to easy to more configurable, right? And I think there's something healthy in the middle. But I think a lot of people, and I'd love to get your thoughts because Kubernetes, as powerful and as interesting as it is, people kind of knock it a little bit for being a bit too complicated, right?
It
So
is complicated.
yeah, yeah, I'd
Kubernetes
like
is
to,
very
yeah,
complicated because for the first time, Kubernetes is saying you need to be very explicit about everything you want
yes,
to do on the computer.
yeah,
Before it's like the network people would do the networking stuff and the load balancer person could be the same person, would do the load balancer stuff. And then you might just use Ansible to deploy to the app and then turn to
hmm
5 other systems to wire it all up. Whereas Kubernetes is like, hold on, every one of those subsystems are going to be baked into the platform, and you
yeah,
now have to express exactly what you want. Now, for someone who used to log into switches and
sure,
learn those commands, and then you got all the other systems and storage systems, think about that for a second. You had to learn like 5 different systems,
yeah,
but sometimes they don't even have APIs, it's just straight command line tools. And then you have to hold in your head that all of these things are configured correctly to play well together and then go on a troubleshooting journey if they don't. In
hmm
the Kubernetes world, this is like the first step that I've seen to kind of, so we had virtualization, which I think was the first step that we tend to forget about. So before Kube, you get this idea of virtualization,
yep,
which leads to the cloud, but we're still just virtualizing all those subsystems and giving them an API
hmm
with their own kind of tunables. Now Kubernetes is saying, hey, what if we give you some abstractions that are like app level focused,
yeah.
and then you tell the infrastructure what to do to support the app? And so I just know that that's not the final destination, but I'm glad we finally taking that step as an industry because
Yep.
I know the next system that comes after Kube can never go backwards. You're
Sure.
going to have a unified API to describe the infrastructure because we now know what that looks like.
Yeah, and I think, I am really I buy into this entire concept of you need to have as much flexibility as you can because the previous generation of folks where, everything you had to configure your own load balancers on premise and you had to do all these things and eh, being able to add some sort of configuration on top of that is really important. I think what really interested me when I first started seeing a lot of these tools come out is like everything is configurable via files that you can just store in source control, right? And I think that was probably at least for me, the biggest value prop as somebody who's had to manage these things in the past. It's like, hey, I no longer have to go from desk to desk to desk, like setting things up for people. I can just give them a file and they can party on it. Like, what value do you put in like that YAML based or JSON based or the text based configuration and how that has empowered, I guess, the new era of developers and ops folks to be successful?
When humans probably learn how to write, they probably discovered this magical thing that you can take what's in your mind and transfer it to someone in the future.
Yeah,
They could come along and look at that and know exactly what to do or what you did. That 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 just changes probably the course of human history.
sure.
So imagine yourself in modern times. You're looking at the computer, and it ain't gonna do anything. It's just gonna sit
Yeah.
there and just do nothing. So at some point, humans have to tell the computer what to do. So now you have to ask yourself, well, how low do you want to go? Do you want to
hmm
talk binary? Or do you want to talk at a level that maybe you or someone else could understand later? And so I think we've always been in search of a better representation of our intentions and something the computer can process,
hmm
right? We don't want these two things to be too far from each other. And so I think with Kubernetes, and listen, I'm not saying Kubernetes is perfect. What I'm saying
Yeah.
is YAML versus JSON versus your favorite thing. What we think we've come to the point of is that humans have a hard time parsing computer code over time. Like if
Sure.
I wrote something in JSON or in JavaScript and told you you need to know what the system would do and all of its side effects, well, that would be hard unless you're really good at reading code or maybe you want to run it through some compiler first to see what's going to actually come out. But data I think we're all agreeing that this declarative approach of saying, I want 3 copies of this app and I want my logs to go over here. Okay, well, how would you describe that in the simplest way possible? And I think we all would imagine it would be in the form of data. And so infrastructure as data allows us to express our intent. Today, people find YAML easier to write, maybe even easier to read. I think that part is subjective, what the serialization format should be.
Sure.
But I think this concept of articulating your desires in a form of data and then the computer being able to pick up that data and behave in an expected way, I think that is probably one of the biggest things that Kubernetes was able to deliver to people, that data, infrastructure as data can work.
Yeah, it's really interesting, kind of your thought process, because I think we live in a world where people are very um, opinionated on the tools and the approaches they want to make, right? So like, whether you're a fan of YAML or not a fan of YAML, or, maybe you want to build things via the CLI, or you want to have things that are a bit more user interface oriented, right? Like these are all things that people will die on the hill for, right? And as somebody who seems like they're a bit more laissez-faire about it, I don't know if that's fair to say for you or not, but like, just give me the tools I want to use to work. Like, how do you navigate this world where there's all these tools out there, and the choice needs to be, okay, which tools do I want to invest in? Because everybody's time is very, very important, right? So, burning cycles on figuring out a new tool and it to be a tool that you don't enjoy, like that's kind of a bummer.
So I think Kubernetes finally answered that question. I used to work at Puppet Labs, and if you wanted to do something, you had to learn the Puppet DSL.
Sure.
If you wanted to extend Puppet, then you had to learn Ruby, and that was it. So if you want to use a new tool, then that tool would have to learn how to parse the Puppet DSL. That was it. There was no, I want to change my front end. So if you think about what Kubernetes does, in order for us to have a different set of tools, we can look no further than like most programming languages. There is assembly code or machine generated code that your compiler does for you.
Yep.
No one wants to write that. But since we have that, that means you can go have Python, Ruby, Golang, and Rust. You can go do all of that now because there's an intermediate format that those things can boil down to. The way I look at Kubernetes YAML file, it is the intermediate format that allows you to say, I prefer Pulumi or Terraform
Mm-hmm.
or Ruby or Python. And now the nice thing about this though is if you use those front ends, whether it's Helm charts or something else, those all must produce the agreed upon schema
Yep.
data format. And if I don't like that front end anymore, I can switch
Mm-hmm.
and the other front end can pick up where it left off. And then I think the most powerful part is you can build pipelines now. You can start with your front end of choice, have it spit out the raw data formats, and then use another tool to do things like security policy checks, making sure that the linter now doesn't have to parse your favorite language. It can just parse the exact same data output that any front end could produce. And I think once you realize that flexibility, yeah, you still have the challenge of finding your favorite front end, but boy, is it nice that you can actually produce one.
Yeah, and it also seems to me like these tools, obviously, a lot of companies have become very, very profitable building tools on, obfuscating some of these concepts to folks that, they might need to balance a handful of different tasks, and just, microservice management is one of them, right? Like, what do you think about the, obviously, you work for a company that is very heavily influencing of what Kubernetes does. But what are your thoughts about all these companies kind of buying into the mind share and building tools to make Kubernetes easier for folks?
Yeah, I mean, I look at this whole space in terms of this opportunity as like the restaurant industry.
Sure.
Anyone can go open a restaurant. You're going to have to compete with the other restaurants.
Mhm.
I think it's very healthy because I think some people know what the financial services sector needs. Some people know what maybe all I want is the simplest thing possible, and I'm willing to take those trade-offs just to make it work. We need all of these vendors. I don't think one vendor will ever have the time, space, or focus
Yep.
to kind of really provide that. So we need 5 different places to get your favorite Thai food from. Some's going to be good at a certain type of dish. So I think the space now is now that we have a common set of ingredients, now people get freedom to go explore and focus on workflows, user experience, solving real use cases, because now not everyone has to go build Kubernetes or something
Yep.
like it first.
Yeah, and that also leads to this idea of like all of these terms that have been created because of tools like Docker and Kubernetes, right? Like I think when Docker first came out, like the idea of containers, I don't think very many people, unless you were very integrated into that ecosystem, were aware of. And now container is just synonymous with everything. Like you'll go to a conference and you'll say, okay, who here is using containers? And people raise their hand. Who knows about containers? And less people raise their hand, right? Where you have the situation where the education hasn't gotten past usability, because containers, the value prop for containers is very, very strong, right? However, people think, okay, it saves me cost or it makes my footprint a bit smaller, but it does so many other things. So what do we do for folks that are seeing kind of what the business impact of things like containers and Kubernetes are, but they might not know like all the additional tangible benefits they might get from them?
So if you're on the platform level, you manage operating systems, you're concerned about security, that's your area of responsibility.
Yep.
Those people need to know all of these things we just talked about, because a lot of times the containerization, even how the kernel continues to evolve around this concept around isolation,
Yep.
and containerization is how we bucketize those ideas, reproducible builds, all of these things. I think containerization has been, kind of a place where we put those ideas, and that's good. So they should know. But to be honest, the average person who just wants to write code
Yeah.
and have it work as expected across multiple platforms, if we're doing a good job, just like you can ship a package with any of the major shipping companies,
Mm-hmm.
no one really knows how cardboard is made. Like, you ever thought of, you sit in your room and like, how do
No.
they make cardboard? You don't
No.
literally care about how cardboard is made. You just know it seems to be sturdy,
Mm-hmm.
it seems to work, it holds my stuff, and most of these places like the post office accept it. I think that is what success looks like for infrastructure. So on one
Mm-hmm.
hand, if you're a shipping company, it may not make a lot of sense to go reinvent the box. So you should know how boxes work and what they're good for and when you need a different type of box. But for people shipping, if we're going to be successful, if you have to know everything about containers to be successful with them, then I think we probably failed a bit. So I think that's one of the biggest Docker's strengths, is that some people don't even know they're using containers under the covers, because it has achieved a lot of that, thing necessary to go mainstream.
Yeah, I mean, I love the anecdote, the analogy of cardboard. Like, we had somebody just hop in chat. I never asked how cardboard is made either. It's just one of those things where you talk about commodities, right? And, like, nobody cares about commodities at all. But some people, they feel like they need to know the ins and outs. And this is something I wanted to ask you. You mentioned specifically about security and ops, right? And Kubernetes introduced this concept of this, let's just use this thing called a sidecar, where it's like, let's take some code and just inject it into your application, or take some functionality and inject it into your application. And I think for a lot of people in the traditional infrastructure administration space, you're like, wait. You're going to insert some code into this app. No, that's not allowed. So, like, how do we talk to people that are a bit more, I guess I don't want to use the phrase legacy because that's not fair, who have a bit more traditional background, and talking about some of
Experience.
the experience, right? Like, how do we talk to folks like that and convince them that some of these mechanisms are beneficial for them?
So what I tend to tell people is, like, you already know 85% of what Kubernetes does.
Sure.
We're just using different terms.
Yep.
So they say sidecars. Kelsey, what is this? You're injecting. It's like, slow down for a second.
Yep.
It's still the Linux kernel. You have always run multiple processes on a Linux box,
Yeah.
whether it was DNS, NTP, your app plus Apache, because you wanted to do some HTTP stuff that you didn't want to
Yep.
encode in your app. This is what you've been doing for 20 plus years.
Sure.
You've already been doing it. I'm saying Kubernetes just says, let's give it a name. Let's call it a pod. Let's
Mm-hmm.
call it a sidecar to represent its role in the hierarchy of your logical application. If you're coming from the JBoss or WebLogic world, your application server was the container, like it
Yep.
was the thing, and then you would inject an ear file, and then that will become part of the service structure. So you've already been doing this. So what I try to do to help them understand is that Kubernetes is not introducing any new laws of computing. It's not changing how the kernel or syscall works and the ability to have multiple processes on a single machine. What it does, though, is say, hey, let's make that explicit so we can understand what the patterns are. Because some people are just doing stuff like,
Sure.
no, dude, you put the app here, you put Apache here, you put
Yeah.
this on this port, and you put this in the config file. That's just how you do it. And they're like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
okay. But most people found it hard to automate those systems because they didn't know the relationship between these dependencies. So what Kubernetes does is says you need to be explicit now. If
Yeah.
you want these two processes to see the same files, then you need to create a volume and explicitly give them
Yeah.
both access. And so all we're doing now is formalizing our practice. That's really what we're doing. And
Mm-hmm.
when I explain it that way, people say, oh, so that's it? I'm like, yeah, that's it. That's all we're doing.
It's so funny that some when somebody who's very educated in the space just says something and everybody can get agreements. That's it. It's like, yeah, that's it. Because I think what's very interesting with that is you mentioned we've been doing this for 20 plus years, right? It's just a matter of now some of the nomenclature has changed, some of the entry points have changed, but your goals are still the same. Your goals are never going to change. In 100 years, when I don't know whatever the thing that's embedded into our eye is doing all of our programming for us, like that's not our business problems aren't going to change. Um, but I think one thing that's really interesting about a lot of these concepts is that they've kind of introduced like this new segment of technology, right? You talked to somebody 10 years ago and you were like, oh, we need to be cloud native, or we need to focus on cloud native technologies, or we need cloud engineers or multi-cloud engineers. Like those weren't jobs that existed. I think even to like multi-cloud engineers don't like that's not even a tangible job title right now, even though it's probably one of the most important ones in the industry. What do you say to some of these tools kind of creating segments of technology that people can get skilled on, people can get hired on, and build careers just getting started?
This is where fundamentals are so critical. There's nothing wrong if you start through these tools and you're introduced to these concepts. But I think that really progresses your career is getting to the fundamentals. For example, you might say, I like spicy food. And I say, oh, you like chili powder. You say, no, 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 I don't like chili powder. I like spicy food.
Sure.
And I was like, but to make it spicy, this is what's in it. It's like, no, 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 I don't even know what that is. I've never seen that before in my life. I've only eaten this food here, this
Sure.
curry. I
Yeah.
say, have you ever seen the ingredients? Have you
Sure.
ever made it before? And they're like, nope, but I just know I like spicy food.
Yeah.
And so I think for us in the tech game is like if you were introduced to config management through Puppet, and you might see Kubernetes as being something different, but Kubernetes and Puppet are very similar. They're both aimed to be declarative systems built around promise theory. You define what you want, and the system has control loops that try to move the system into the desired state. And until it gets there, it keeps trying to do so. That is the fundamentals. So if you were learning Puppet and you said, oh, okay, Puppet could be associated with DevOps, it could be associated with configuration as code, but you could also associate it with just like control loops and promise
Mm-hmm.
theory.
Sure.
So when you see something else that implements that, it's like, oh, that's like the other thing. I
Mm-hmm.
know what to do here. The UI or the implementation is slightly different.
Yeah, and it goes back, harkens back to what we're saying. Is like it's the same thing. Like there are lots of companies that have created this space for themselves, and they've created a tag or a buzzword around what they're doing, even though it's the same thing. And that's just great marketing, which I really, really appreciate. Right, the ability to turn something that people already are using and convince them there's something else. Right. I like to pivot a little point in this conversation and talk like what gets you excited. We talked about a little bit about why you got excited initially, but I mean, let's be frank. You've been in tech for a while. You've earned some level of status. Like, why do you keep going? Why do you keep pushing forward to kind of learn more things and try to help more people? Like, what's in it for you, and why are you enjoying it so much?
Yeah, I think there's the last 5 years I asked that question quite a bit. What else are you going to do? Are you going to give a better talk? Are
Yeah.
you going to create a better open source project? You can get more followers on Twitter. What are you going to get?
Yep.
And so every time I think about kind of throwing in the towel, maybe considering early retirement or something, the thing that pulls me back in is when people send, I mean, someone sent me a DM the other day. Thank you for existing.
Wow.
That that's deeper than being explicit sometimes.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
over the years, I get these stories around, hey man, I finally got a job in tech. I'm making good money now. I can get my own place. I can help out my mom. And look, dude, like you just kind of get emotional with that kind of thing. You start to say, okay, that's why I'm still doing this
Yeah.
because new people are born every day. New people come into a situation where they need to just do better for themselves. And I guess as long as I'm alive, that's going to be a thing that I'm going to always enjoy doing. But I can't help people if I don't know how. If I'm not
Yeah.
keeping up to date on the skills, if I'm not learning the new stuff, then I kind of feel personally that the amount of help I can give to people in the future is predicated on me continue to grow also as a person, analyze my growth. And one way I do that is just by learning in public. And I'll tell you, man, like every time we build something new at GCP, and then I can text a customer and say, hey, could you try the
Sure.
solution to the thing you found? And they say, yo, this is much better. We
Yeah.
can now move on to a new feature. I don't know, man. That is the sole thing I would say keeps me going.
Yeah, so it seems to me like you feel like you have some responsibility to the next generation, right? To folks that are either they're entering themselves into tech from other careers, that are getting started in school, or maybe they just have an interest because they've heard you before and they like your style of delivery and they like hearing what you have to say. Like, do you feel, I guess you mentioned a little bit, do you feel pressure to continually learn more, do things better, be more open, be more transparent, try to raise people up? Do you feel like you have like a responsibility to do that, and if there's a challenge there?
I have pressure to do it well,
Yeah.
and I have the privilege of doing it at all.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So when I was coming up, I mean, I remember vividly. I went to Barnes and Noble and bought an A plus certification book. I
Sure.
got $35. I got to choose wisely.
Yeah.
So I get the A plus book. I drive home, and I'm on my mom's carpet flipping through this book. Like, what does all this mean?
Yeah.
Like, what is a motherboard? What is a bus? A bus? Like the ones you drive? Oh, okay.
Sure.
That's what these lines are on the motherboard. Okay, let me put all this together. And then you go and get that A plus certification. Like you literally pass the test and you get the paper certificate. And it feels like at that very moment you have gained permission to go be successful.
Sure.
All because of this flow and the author of that particular book. And so thinking back to kind of like how I got started and where I am now, you mean to tell me I get to be that person
Sure.
for
Sure.
someone else? How privileged can one be? And so the pressure comes from I need to do it well. If
Yeah.
I throw out an analogy or I throw out a recommendation, I need to be honest, I need to be authentic, and I know someone may go repeat it, so it can't be wrong, or they're gonna be looking embarrassed, like, yo, that Kelsey
Sure.
dude brought down production. I don't
Yeah.
want to be that person.
Yeah. I mean, and I think there's something to say, like, to use the very cliche, overused term, standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Like, we all have, a place to be, or a difference to make. And I think one of the things that I really appreciate about you is that you're very enthusiastic about things, but you're also very critical about things too. Like, this stream, for folks that are watching it in the future, this is like middle of January in 2022, and the world is hot right now with this Web3 stuff, right? And I use Web 2.0 like in air quotes all the time because I really don't know what it means, other than like that's when web development actually started to be interesting. And now Web 3 is turning that on its head in a different way. And one of the things I really appreciated is like you started to try to figure it out for yourself in the open. And I will say, it's watching you has been pretty hilarious, seeing that experience. Like, I would like to get, because that's a whole new concept for everybody, right? Like, what has been your experience like learning along with everybody else? Because I think most of us, we learn after a lot of people, people that have maybe built the framework or have been leaders in the framework, but we're all learning at the same time. What has been your experience, working with bits that aren't even close to done yet?
Yeah, so this is probably one of the few times in my career where a lot of this technology is political.
Sure.
it almost starts from a place of politics. Um, my introduction to open source was very similar. So when I was learning open source in 1999, 1998, Linux was challenging the Solarises and AIX of the world. And even down to the licensing, I remember taking an online course on software licensing
Yeah,
and what that means. And there was a lot of political stuff there, like, hey, the big proprietary software vendors, they're locking up innovation, they're making it inaccessible. And so there was this movement around, we got to go break that up. And remember, they were going against the biggest tech giants of all time
yeah,
and saying, we're going to compete with you. And we don't care if we don't make a single dollar in our endeavor, as long as people have the right to build software and have it be free. So that was like my first introduction to tech and politics. Now in 2022, I'm seeing people have their life savings, their hopes,
yeah,
their financial future tied to the success of a technology. Now, I've been at a lot of startups, and I would say people who work in a startup similarly have,
sure.
this kind of connection to their long-term future for that business to work. But in this case, it feels like some people have convinced themselves that number one, they named what we're currently doing. Like, I don't think anyone that's working on what we're working on has ever thought of the cloud as being a Web 2.0 technology. Like, we're just like,
Sure.
oh, okay. I guess we're Web 2 now. I didn't know that, so
Yeah,
thanks. And then
yeah.
Web 3 aims to be better than the thing you're doing.
Hmm.
And I've seen this before. The cloud versus on-prem, legacy, microservices versus monoliths.
Hmm.
We've seen this kind of play out where you get these tribes that form around these ideas. So for me, what I try to do is step back from that and say, okay, look, I get why people are very passionate about their source of income or
Yeah,
potential to change things, because I do think the Web3 folks make some valid concerns
yeah,
about platform limitations when it comes to end users' right to their data, et cetera. But the thing that's weird though is that the way it's being promoted as if it's GA production ready.
yeah,
And so when I talk to the builder, so I'm very fortunate that people who actually work on the Ethereum blockchain will take time to share their screen with me, to
yeah,
walk me through the implementation. They'll say, Kelsey, look, this thing ain't ready. Like 14 transactions per second
yeah,
isn't the final solution. It isn't the
yeah.
best we can do. And if you've ever worked at a company that sells technology, sometimes marketing can get way ahead of where you
Oh,
are in
I
terms of
work
what
in
you're building.
marketing. I work in marketing. I totally get it. We love to talk about things that don't exist yet. But
Yeah,
continue.
so I
Sorry.
think that puts a lot of pressure on all parts of that community. So
Yeah.
if you're working on something, you do want time and space to make it better. So when people like me come around and criticize something, because maybe I'm listening to the marketing side of the
Hmm.
conversation, or maybe people who have ulterior motives on why they wanted to succeed. And so the builder will say, man, Kels, why are you raining on our parade over here? We're just trying to build, just like you were trying to build when you were working at Puppet Labs or when you
Yeah.
were contributing to Kubernetes. And so I try to be balanced in that approach, but I also try to be authentic. And this is why I'll do like a live tweet. All right, you all told me that this IPPF thing was the hotness.
Yeah.
I want
Yeah.
to store some files. Hey, my file's gone. What the hell is this? This is
Yeah.
not a replacement for
Yeah.
S3. And
Yeah.
then people will engage. So I call that learning in public.
Yeah. It's interesting because uh, I can't remember the gentleman who wrote. He's a security expert, and he wrote a really long blog post. I can't remember his
Moxie.
name. Yeah, Moxie, right? He put together this great blog post because somebody who is very familiar in the space is like, I'm just gonna see if I can figure out how to get this thing to work. And he made some very interesting observations about, oh, things can just magically disappear. Like, that doesn't seem right. Like, I can buy something, but then somebody can go in and make it and alter it without really my permission. And I think one of the things that is interesting about this entire space is people think that is, and maybe it's just people see it as their opportunity to lift themselves from where they currently are, because there is a financial piece tied to all of this blockchain stuff, right? Right? You know, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, you hear blockchain, you immediately think of cryptos, right? Cryptocurrencies, and people, I think, maybe see this as an opportunity to get rich. I don't want to say get rich quick, but get rich using technology. And my fear is, to your point, if something isn't ready, and a lot of people invest all of their money, like you're talking about, and then this thing falls down, and lots of people lose lots of money, it only hurts the underlying technology that could be very impactful for non currency related activity. So how do we
So
balance that?
this is the trickiest thing because what I've learned to do is step back and look at it from a human perspective. I am a bit sad that capitalism, some parts of it, have evolved into this need to fight for survival. It's beyond just making good investments. It's beyond just working hard. There's a lot of people believing now that I have to gamble, whether it's in the stock market, at Las Vegas, play the lottery, or invest in a cryptocurrency because it may go to the moon. This part, if you step back and say, damn, how did we society get into a point where people feel that they need to do that? Now, look, if people want to go and play the lottery or play poker or whatever, look, I've never cared about someone wanting to fly to Vegas and losing their money because that's bad too. The world
Yeah,
has a gambling problem. But I think that technology or technologists not being clear and transparent, that this thing that we built had a primary use case. Other people have taken the technology and decided that it could be a better Vegas than
yeah,
Vegas.
yeah,
It can give access to people. I actually met a person and said, Kelsey, I have a gambling problem. And I met with them one on one just to understand what that means.
yeah,
And I didn't know that there's a thing where you can send a like letter or say, never let me gamble. And you can register yourself as someone addicted to gambling
oh
and the
wow,
sites won't let you log in anymore.
that's
That's
awesome.
actually a thing. But
Yeah,
then this crypto thing comes around and says, you can now gamble on tens of thousands of tokens all
yeah,
day long in real time. And there is no, you don't even have to fly. You don't have to learn anything. It's so easy just to put your money in and we will pump it to the moon and make people feel like they're investors, even though they
yeah,
may be gambling. And that part I think is a bit predatory. And
yeah.
I just can't reconcile that one.
It's really interesting too because as somebody who has worked with customers and been a consultant, I see blockchain technology as like, oh, this can solve a ton of business problems in the microtransaction space. But for whatever reason, it's been, whether it's intentional or unintentionally, coupled to, oh, here's an opportunity for decentralized banking,
And
right?
to be fair, this
Yeah.
isn't the first time I've seen things be hijacked. Like DevOps got hijacked. I remember it
Yes.
being hijacked,
Sure.
right? DevOps try to absolve people of their own responsibilities. You actually do need to learn how this stuff works.
Yeah.
You do need to gain the skills over time, and you do need to hold yourself accountable. And you can't try to say it's just a cultural problem. Yeah, there's a culture problem, but who cares if your culture is perfect and you still don't have skills to
Yeah.
get the job done? So there's a bit of accountability. And I saw a lot of teams waste a bunch of time doing the whole DevOps tribe, and to the point where the DevOps folks tried to isolate themselves from everyone else
Yeah.
and labeled everything else legacy. Hey, the
Yes.
stuff that pays our bills, that's legacy stuff, and we're going to work hard to get rid of it. And some people saw that as you're working hard to get rid of me because that's the system I work on.
Yeah.
So we see this come up in communities all the time. It's just the one that makes this one feel very critical is that society as a whole feels like this is the only thing you can do to earn a living
Yeah.
and survive.
Even to the effect where I'm on TikTok and I'll see ads on TikTok all the time for like, Bitcoin bots, right? Bots that will basically you give it access to your wallet, which is terrifying to me, but it just proceeds to just buy and sell, microtransactions back and forth, and it's like, oh, look, it's like instead of the coins being so volatile, like this is AI prediction, so it allows you to just grow over time. It's like, okay, that's interesting, but at the same time, you're giving a lot of trust to something that is intended to help you. And sure, they're very transparent, saying, yeah, per transaction there's a fee, but can you still trust them with access to, like you said, their life savings for some folks, right? That have decided to go all into crypto. How do we reconcile these open source technologies? You know, blockchain being one of them, to an extent even microservices like that. Like microservices aren't like it's a product, it's a concept. So how do we reconcile with these large businesses? I've worked at some, you've worked at some, that have tried to productize or figure out some way to build revenue generation on top of these concepts and technologies.
So I think one thing that has happened in modern times is the ability to create and disrupt at an individual level is higher than ever. And so let's say we don't like the way Bitcoin is going or Web3 is going. One thing we all forget is that a lot of these companies have been around for 100 years.
Sure.
So how do you be around from 100 years? What you do is every time someone comes to disrupt you, you pay attention,
Mhm.
you see what parts are useful, and you do what you're good at, which is providing services to your customers. That's what you do.
Yeah.
So anyone can come along and say, "Oh, we're going to put you out of business." It's like, okay, that's fine. How are you going to put me out of business? We're going to put you out of business by giving data back to the users. Okay, I'll
Mm.
go ask my users, is that what you want? And your users might say, yes, I really do want my data and I want to give it to you in a different way. I can literally make that happen. I can do that. So I think the net benefit. So let's say whether you're on the Web 2 or Web 3 side as a builder, let's put that to the side for a second.
Sure.
The average consumer benefits from this type of competition because one side will try to highlight the flaws in the other. And if they either one wants to be successful, they're going to have to take the good parts from each other and move forward. That's it. That's all you can do. Whether you believe that your way and should be a purest form, great. Try that. I don't think you're going to ever make it mainstream. Time will tell. So the thing I love about this whole space right now, the jokes aside, is
Yeah.
that people are actually poking holes and presenting opportunities for improvement, and the good builders will show up and improve things. That's what's going to happen. And so at the end of the day, in 10 years from now, if Web3 is successful, because when you're successful in technology, you earn the prize of being ignored.
Yeah.
Successful technologies get ignored because they work so well that there's nothing
Yeah.
to talk about. And so that's the way I look at this. Worst case, we just won't be talking about it in 10 years.
Maybe I'm a bit of a pessimist. I think worst case probably looks a bit worse than that. But I think in general, I think you're spot on. From a macro perspective, in the future, none of it's going to matter if it doesn't work, right? In the micro level, for a lot of people, if it doesn't work out, it's not a good look.
Well, all right. So to be fair, I've tweeted that I have a fear
Yeah.
that society is not in a good, healthy place to be thinking about evolutions at this level.
Sure.
Turning the whole world into a set of microtransactions doesn't sound very appealing to me. The
Sure.
idea that I want to play an online game to earn a percentage of a token and then like lose sleep because this is like the way that I'm going to get out of poverty and not necessarily other opportunities we could be investing in as a society, that part does not resonate well with me. The
Yeah.
idea that people would favor a virtual world over the real world. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with the virtual world. I'm just saying that there's nothing wrong, in case shouldn't be wrong, with the real world.
Sure.
Why is it so bad to walk amongst the flowers and breathe the air and the mountains
Yeah.
and the rivers? Like, why would we continue to destroy those things and then promise to make a better place in the virtual world? Like, The Matrix isn't that great of a movie. I don't know why people would want to replicate it in real life.
I will say The Matrix is a good movie. However, living in the Matrix probably would not be enjoyable.
At least for me. At least for
I no,
me.
and I totally agree. And as somebody who, rightfully so, would rather probably be in front of my computer than out in nature because that's my temperament, I do see that there's a lot of things that have been, a lot of ideas that have been harvested over the last 2 years because of the situation that this world is in right now, right? Where, yeah, I don't want to go outside. I don't want to have to intermingle with people. You made a point earlier about gambling, having to get on a flight or go into a casino or rub shoulders with people at a craps table, right? Like the ability to roll out of bed and start feeding addictive behavior is very interesting for a lot of people, right? So the question is how do we create channels that allow people to feel comfortable enough to say, yeah, I can't be around this stuff. even though if I work in tech, it's, I can't log into Twitter without seeing a Web3 hashtag, right?
I think the first step that we have to say, this experiment we've been on, because it hasn't been very long for humans as a
Yes.
species to have been submerged in such addictive behavior that sits in your pocket right at the ready,
Yeah.
right? Like even drug addicts have to work to go get the drugs.
Yeah.
This is something that just walk around with you. And right now, this is one of the most addictive things that we've ever been introduced to that is considered good, right? This thing is considered, you should have the latest and greatest smartphone. You should be tech savvy. Everyone should learn how to do these things. And so I think we have to be very careful and step back and be critical and say, look, is this really what we should be doing? Should we really be arguing with people on the internet all day long?
Yeah.
Should we really turn every human interaction into a microtransaction?
Yeah.
I don't think that is the best outcome for humanity. So I think what we have to do is start to have that conversation. So the one thing I like about Web3, I'm finally hearing some people have a conversation about these activities that people participate in. Right now, a lot of it is about owning your own data and getting a piece of the pie.
Mm.
But how about we uplevel that conversation towards keeping your sanity, finding your humanity, and maintaining it?
But it's, I appreciate all of that, and I think you made something a point at the end that I think is very interesting, like owning a piece of the data and getting, reimbursed for it. I had a conversation on the show a couple of weeks ago with somebody who works in the identity space, and it's about like decentralized identity, right? And it's like, okay, you do understand that all decentralization means is that there's just more people that are getting access to your stuff. They just have to go through you. So you become a singular point of contact. But at the end of the day, you still need trusted providers, right? And to be honest, there's only like 3 companies on the planet that have figured out how to be like an identity provider, right? And do it right. And, I would be interested to see what the potential is for revenue sharing in that space. For instance, you know, Google or Amazon or Microsoft or one of these big companies, they have all this data on you that they're making money from. Maybe they can give you a little piece of it. And I'd like to get your thoughts on like how people can take the intellectual property that is their self and figure out a way to be successful with it. And I know that's a really weirded phrase question. Let me ask it
So
again.
here's the truth is
Yeah.
probably no one wants your data by itself.
Oh, I hope not.
Most people, most advertisers just don't really care about
Yeah.
your individual data.
Yeah.
They care most about what are you probably most likely to buy
Mm-hmm.
and when. That's more important. So if I was an advertiser and I had to give you $5 for your data set, I just don't want it. Like
Yep.
that's not what I want. What I want to know is, would you buy this?
Yep.
And so I do think it's good to challenge the current way that we do it. I think one thing I heard Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, talk about this particular business model. There's flaws in this business model. I think people should continue to call it out. I'm not going to try to defend it to the end. But
Mm-hmm.
the one thing is, a lot of services in life, access is determined about how much money you have.
Yeah.
Certain things you can never have access to because it just costs too much. But there's only one Google search, right? If you're a billionaire, you get the same Google search
Yep.
as someone that has $0, right? Because we just don't have an incentive to optimize it more based on how much money you have or actually who you are.
Now think
Everyone
of the
gets this.
business model there though. Like rich people search. Could you imagine like that somebody would actually buy it? Like cuz and I sorry to interrupt you, but there's all these freemium services, right? Like could search be a freemium feature?
I mean, you could make it freemium, but what makes search good? What makes
Yeah.
YouTube good? Is YouTube good because uh, you can watch everything and have shared global experiences, or rich people watch a thing that you can never see? So
Sure.
imagine a YouTube that had a thing that said, if you're at a billionaire status, which there's only so many of those, you get to watch this type of stuff. And if you're a millionaire, you get to watch this type of stuff. And if you don't have any money, then anything that we consider high value, like learning a new skill, well, that's only for people that can afford college tuition level access. And so then what happens? Is that really best for the most people? I don't know if that gives you the same experience. So the other
Mm-hmm.
thing is if you're a creator, getting to tap into the entire ecosystem, right? You get to tap into all the people because it has equal access. And so this is one business model that we've been experiment as a society is people paying with their eyeballs.
Yep.
Like you can listen to this music on the radio, but you have to be willing to listen to ads.
Yep.
That's the trade-off, or you just got to turn it off. And so there could be a better business model. So the other proposed business model is the one that we're kind of seeing is like I think the newspaper industry is going through this right now. You click on a link and it's like, hey, to read this article, it's going to be $8 this one time or
Yeah.
$200 per year. And you're
Yeah.
like, dude, I am not giving 5 news outlets $200 a year. Well,
Yeah.
depending on the type of content you see. So we have to see which one of these things will actually be long-term successful. And then some would argue some content shouldn't be behind a paywall.
Yeah.
So how do you sustain it? So we'll see. I think there's room for nonprofits like Wikipedia, companies like Let's Encrypt, who've up-leveled this concept of what does it mean to have common goods for society? And that's another business model. We just got to make sure we can make those things sustainable.
Yeah. You also mentioned like you mentioned the news industry, and one of the things that I've seen a lot recently is you'll have like a headline, and inside the actual article is a video, and that video has ads. So like not only are they getting ads on the page, they're getting ads on the video too, right? So it's just a very sophisticated way to get as many ad placements as possible in a touch point with a user. And I'm not against ads. Like I have a lot of services that I don't see the value in paying for the ad less version because I don't mind ads. But as somebody who stopped with a cable subscription a few years ago and went on vacation, and my kids were in a hotel room which had commercials, they're like, Dad, what's that toy? I'm like, I don't know what that toy is. That toy doesn't exist in our house. How do we figure out an effective way to not over pollute the community with advertisements? Because it seems to me everywhere that you touch now, there's an advertisement. And everything that you see is an advertisement. Even if you buy a game for $60, there's ads in the game. So it's like at what point do we get an ad-free experience completely?
I just think, man, like this global appetite to be perpetually growing as a business.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can't just have a business where you make $20 billion a year in profit every year without fail. Imagine
Mm-hmm.
that you make 20 billion in profit.
Yeah.
Well, the market and investors will say that's not enough. We need 20% growth year over year. And the minute that stops, we don't care how much you're making in profit.
Yeah.
The minute the growth stops, the minute we're out. And then I think that encourages behaviors like, yes, this is a very great game that everyone lines up to buy when it's launched, and we make a cool 3 billion in profit, and it's totally sustainable. But man, they want to see 3.3 billion
Yep.
next quarter. What can we do to get that other 300 million? What if we throw some ads in there? That'll net another 400 million.
Yep.
And you say, all right, we'll just do one ad. And then someone
Just one.
says, if you put 3 ads, we'll
Yeah.
give you another billion. He's like, wow, man, we'll grow. So I think there's something about this need to continue to grow, or this desire to grow encourages people to want to inject more growth opportunities. And I think the advertisement industry, since before the internet, has
Yep.
always found their way into subsidizing things, whether it's a concert, a New Year's Day parade, the Super Bowl, and said, hey, we will let that content be free if you let us put our ad in the middle.
Yeah.
Is there any other business model willing to step up to say you don't have to do that anymore? That's going to be the answer to that question. Who
Yeah.
steps up and says, yeah, I will pay, and maybe this is what the Web3 people have right. Maybe it has to be easy to pay for all of these engagements that we have with the various tools and services we use. I think subscription models, if you buy software through a subscription model, you better
Yep.
not see no ad. You're like, yo, I'm paying. Like Google Cloud,
Yeah.
there's no ads inside of
Yeah.
Google Cloud, right? Like, hey, hold on, I'm not paying for
You know,
ads.
You know somebody has had that conversation though. Like you know for a fact there's been conversations like, but maybe if we put some ads to like other services that Google sells, or even like using Amazon, like, oh, maybe we put like recommendations like for people like things that people can buy like hardware and things like that. You know those conversations are being had because your statement about growth is so spot on. Like to the effect that a company's stock price can go down even though they made more money than they did last quarter and year over year, but the growth number went down 1 or 2 points. Like that is enough to make analysts and stock market folks just go, nope, this company's not doing it for me anymore, and they sell, and that hurts a huge chain of people,
And we
right?
see open source projects fall victim to this as well. I mean, sometimes you want more stars on your GitHub repo.
Yeah,
You want to grow unnaturally. So you start to
yeah,
do things in a single project that shouldn't be done. And everyone's like, why are you doing this? And we see this all the time, like especially when you come back to business. Like, I want to start a business around this project. And that's
yep,
tends when we see projects start to go sometimes, not all the time, in the wrong direction. So I think the answer to your question is we got to figure out this human and this desire to unnecessarily grow all the
yeah,
time versus stability.
yeah. And I think one of the things I want to be clear on, it's growth is good. Certain growth, like educational growth, experience growth, like these things are really, really important for as society. Like stepping outside of work, the reason why I like doing this show is because I can have conversation with people from all different walks of life, all different upbringings, all different entry points into tech, but we all share one common thing: we like tech, and we want to make careers out, and we want to try to make it better. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting for me is that outside of these conversations, you build on top of the existing bias you have to create potentially unbiased thoughts. And that's what I'm looking for is somebody who has biases. I'm trying to dissolve them.
Yeah,
And I think,
I
yeah,
think
go ahead.
one thing we found hard, especially like in the open source community, is when someone steps up to do exactly what you said. They come out and they build something and they have, let's say, the right motives. Because in order to do things like this, you also have to have the luxury of not needing to conform to societal expectations. Like you might say,
Sure.
nope, I'm good with it being the size. The problem is, how do we find sustainability? What happens when that
Yes.
person 5 years from now says, I am tired. I've given you all that I can give, and I need to step down from this. Who steps up with the same fundamental beliefs, the same integrity, the same everything, and is willing to pick up the torch and continue on? That part, I think, is a real tough thing that a lot of these things are just not sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, and that's like the question to ask and answer, right? It's like I think everybody can make an admission to some point that tech in general has some inherent flaws to it. And the question is how do we fix it? Do we go down the path of trying to build up the next generation that's better than us, how traditionally we better as a society by making the next generation better? Do we try to introduce new concepts or technologies or what have you to make things more equitable for everybody? Do we attempt to just, to your point, be completely anti-establishment, right? Like I see Web3 as like very anti-establishment way of thinking. Do we try to go down that path? And I think that there's no right answer. It's an amalgamation of kind of everything. And I think one of the things that, as we're wrapping up, I'd love to get your thoughts on like, what's the singular thing that you see in tech that you think that if enough people subscribe to it today, we can make tech a more inclusive place for folks? And that's a really loaded question, I know. So feel free to phrase that any way you want.
I think the whole open source philosophy did that for me.
Sure.
The fact that I can see the code, the fact that there's a community of people you've never met willing to like figure out how to onboard you, review your code, your contributions. I mean, think about it. You can even just open an issue on a random project and say, hey,
Yeah.
I'm having this problem. And someone who doesn't owe you anything steps up and says, hey, let me give you some customer service here and try to fix this
Mm-hmm.
particular bug, and then open the doors for you to do the same for the next set of people that are yet to come. Like to me, that whole philosophy is the game changer because that means any problem you see in the technology space, you can always fork the project, enhance the project, and then go solve any problem that
Yep.
you yourself are capable of solving, or rally a community behind you and then go solve it together. That to me is the game changer. And I think, when we start to talk about anti-establishments and like the government and things like that, yes, they have been ignoring user experience for so long, is
Mhm.
almost if it felt like they just didn't care. But I think one shining light is like, think about it. The new, if you're in the US, the whole I need a set of COVID tests, there's a website now that
Yeah.
you can go to, and people are like, how easy it is. Like in a few minutes,
Yep.
you can go fill out your information, hit enter, and they say your tests are on the way. Like,
Yeah.
think about what web framework they've used. I'm pretty sure it's open source. My
Yeah.
guess is they're hosting it on some open source Linux kernel thing, and maybe they're running it for a few bucks, or maybe it's being subsidized by a technology partner that says that this is a good thing that needs to happen.
Yep.
And typically, projects like this, usually there's only a handful of people involved that says we can do something better here. So I think the open source philosophy and just educating people, that means they're empowered and they can go tackle these things regardless of who gives them permission.
I mean, that's a great thing to think about, right? It's just bettering everything in tangible ways that doesn't just benefit tech but benefits society. And I think that's great, and I really appreciate your thoughts. So we're at the top of the hour, or we're at the top of our hour, and I really appreciate you spending the time to chat with me. Um, Before we go, I love to ask my guests, one last question. If they can, summarize open source or technology or the community around it, what would that word be for you? And maybe give a little bit of reasoning as to why.
I mean, the thing about open source is that if you were to draw up this movement today, people would say it would be impossible. Who would work for free? Who
Yeah,
would put their best out ideas out there and not attempt to profit from them?
yeah,
It almost, in many ways, the way you hear people talk about human nature is always associated with something like greed, or it's inevitable that we would behave this way.
sure,
And open source seems to just prove that's just not true. There are so many people that put their toy projects up or things that create industry standards, and they do it because they believe that it should exist. And I think open source to me has just been this reminder that there are good people globally. It's not just a US thing, it's not just a Europe thing. People all over the world, the gates aren't very high in the open source world. And where there are gates, we're teaching people how to climb them all the time.
yep.
And so I don't know, I just feel like open source to me is just this thing, this human experience that people do know how to come together and make something happen and sustain it for everyone else, regardless of their ability to profit from it. That should be one of the biggest examples that humanity has ever produced over the last 30, 40 years in terms
Yeah.
of what does it look like when society comes together and makes something happen.
That's that's great, and I have nothing else to say because that was pretty awesome. So again, Kelsey, I want to thank you so much for coming on stream and chatting with me, and you know, paying attention to some of the things that you're saying. I think are really spot on. So I highly uh, recommend people follow Kelsey on Twitter and every other place. It's at Kelsey Hightower. And again, thank you so much for being on the show. And for everybody else tuning in, enjoy the rest of your day. And I hope you take care. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Bye.